Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Wayfare podcast. Today, we're going to be going over the marketing section of the Strategy Workbook. For those who are just jumping in on this episode, we are working through the Strategy Workbook that my production agency provides for all of our clients. It's a free resource that you can utilize, review, redo every time you jump into a new season of your show, anytime you want to start a new show in general. We are going over the marketing section. And what that will look like today is going over just how to present your podcast, how to utilize show notes, how to generally market it, just not even the presentation, but also getting it out to people. And a little bit of everything in between, I hope. There's only going to be, on this particular page, we're on page 18, there's only going to be 6 check boxes to go through, but that's not exclusive to podcasting. There's way more opportunities out there, but these are some of the easier ones to tackle first. So on the first part of the list, we have podcast album artwork. I tell people the album artwork is going to be the very first impression that anyone who is looking up your podcast, that's the first thing that they're going to look at. That's the first thing that they're going to run into in, for better or for worse, judge your show. And so you want to make sure that it's very eye-catching. You want to make sure it's on brand. You want to make sure it's approachable too. So usually what that's going to look like is, so on brand, I'm going to think of the, I've been saying album artwork, by the way, and it says album artwork on here. It's kind of confusing when I say album, but what that means is like the cover artwork. Podcast cover artwork is probably a better word for that. But the thing that I usually recommend to people is to, like I said, make sure it's on brand. So for this, I was thinking of my brand for the Wayfare recording brand for this particular artwork that we have for this show going on. And so it's on brand. It's deeper blue, a little bit of black, a little bit of gray, a little bit of white. And for the video portion of this, if you're watching this on video, you'll see that there's a title card that's in red as well. In the workbook, if you're looking at this, the front cover, that's in red as well. So we want to make sure it's very consistent and familiar. Those are both keywords for the podcasts, for podcasting on the whole. And the other thing is making sure that there's a form of familiarity. One of the bigger things that I've been kind of in talks with lately is getting like a familiar face on there. So usually when there's a podcast, you have a host, you have someone that's consistently showing up and kind of being your entry point into the conversation. So usually it's good to have that person on the cover art, because when they're going to see the cover art, they're going to see the face, and so when they click on it, they expect to see that same person on the podcast. These are very relatively general ideas. There's no wrong way of doing it, and there is no I guess there is kind of a wrong way of doing it. But I mean, it's up to interpretation on how you want to execute your cover art, I guess. So I guess, run with that for what it's worth. The big thing, the critical thing that I want to stress on this, though, is that it does need to be 3,000 by 3,000 pixels. That is the dimensions that Apple Podcast accepts the artwork as. I'm not a graphic designer, but I usually tell people, if you can communicate that with whomever you go with on your design for the artwork, I hope they know what that means and they can run with it. So yeah, that's the general idea for artwork. If you have any questions on that, feel free to reach out and I can kind of get a little bit more specific to your needs. Because again, I'm kind of speaking to the broader audience for this show. The needs of a B2B podcast is going to be different from the needs of a personality ran podcast, is going to be different from the needs of whomever. So the next thing on the list is show notes template. What that means is like, show notes are going to be really important for communicating anything extraneous for the listener. So, for this show, we have the YouTube description, we have the podcast show notes, and that is the way that you can communicate any particularities that you think the listener is going to need to know, whether it's before, during, or after the show. So what I mean by that is like, the before is you have a simple summary of the show. What can the listener expect by going and jumping into listening to the show? You have the during. So, I said at the beginning of this show, we are working through this PDF, we're working through this workbook. So while someone's listening to the show, they can go to the description of the show notes and download the PDF while they're listening to me. And that can also be applicable to the after too. Like, they're listening, again, if you're new to this and you're listening to this and you're interested in everything that I'm talking about, like, oh yeah, I want the PDF. Maybe you'll finish listening to this episode and then go in and download it. And that can be included for, the timeline. I try to include chapters on these episodes. So, you can kind of get a before glimpse of seeing, what are they going to talk about? What am I going to talk about in this show? And maybe you like something that you heard and you want to jump back to it later. You can click on that. And show notes are going to be pretty important too, because depending on how the information is collected by the hosting platform, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, like I like to tell people, think of like the show notes as like the SEO of your podcast. If you're not actually hosting it on a Squarespace site or WordPress or, whatever, like this is going to be what data is going to be collected to help push your show forward in search results. Now, I'm not a web designer. I'm not someone who's knowledgeable in SEO at all, but I know that having those type of words populated in your show notes does help emphasize and drive the point home of what information is going to be pushed for searching. So again, I'm not super knowledgeable, but I do know that much. So if you have any more questions on that, you can reach out and we can talk about it. But I would be more than happy to help direct you into someone who's much more well knowledgeable in that area. So, and the same thing goes for the next point, keywords, hashtags. I know Simplecast and Buzzsprout use keywords and hashtags. Hashtags, is the same thing as keywords, but they utilize keywords for categorizing and, again, pushing the episode forward through its searchability. Same idea, just more opportunities for you to fill in blanks to make sure that everything in your show is correct for that searchability. And then, so that's kind of like the essential items. That's what I have under essential items on the page. But to get more into the nuance of how to push your show out for exposure, I have social media accounts, I have web development, and I have email newsletters. These things are pretty well, again, the audience I'm trying to speak to is going to be more broad. So it's not going to be just solopreneurs, personality driven, B2B, it's going to be different for everyone. Like maybe a personality ran podcast, people are listening for the person that they're interested in. Maybe they're not immediately able to do the email newsletter, but they're able to do the social media account stuff because, that's how they, influencer is kind of what I mean by personality-driven shows. Maybe social media is going to be better for that. If you're a B2B podcast, email newsletter is a great opportunity to get your show exposed to your audience, to your clientele, to your to the people on your newsletters. And then same thing for website development. It's just kind of like, hey, don't forget, we also have a podcast. So you have a podcast tab on your website. You might try to push the podcast through, maybe the footer of your website. And there's a lot of opportunities to get your podcast out there. And again, these are ideas. If you have any other specific ideas or much more cater to what you have, like go for it. There's no wrong way to show your podcast to the mass. These are just a couple of little ideas. So that'll be it for this episode. I believe from this point on, we have one more formal episode left, and then I'm going to do a little bit of a epilogue. So this is, we're getting to the end here. And if you enjoyed this episode and you're checking it out for the first time, again, we have several other episodes for you to check out. Be sure to check out the show notes in the description. Depending on what you're listening to, audio or video, we'll have the PDF available for you to download if you want to check it out. Again, it's free. And like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. Really helps out the show a lot, get good exposure. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.